Morning, students. Once again, welcome to yet another episode of my online video lectures. And for today, we are going to talk about the next step of your research writing process, which is the construction of your interview guide questions. Now, to begin, it's how to construct an interview guide. Before we delve into the details of the preparation of your interview guide questions, please take note that these questions are for qualitative research purposes only. For quantitative research questions, there is a different set of guidelines that will have to be met by the researchers. So, this is me coming from a qualitative research standpoint. Okay, to begin, let's give an overall structure as to what we will be discussing in today's video. Okay, it's first we are going to talk about validity. This one is validity both in assessment and in research. And next we are going to proceed to the writing of the interview guide questions, subdivided into the guidelines, the types of questions that you can ask, and the steps that you will have to take in constructing these interview guide questions. Okay, let's begin. Now, whenever you construct a set of questions, there is an overarching concept called validity. Now, in research, validity is mostly used in quantitative research, but validity is a very common thing. It's even used in the field of education. Now, to start the discussion of validity, according to TCIT, usf.edu, validity refers to the accuracy of the assessment, or in this case, your interview guide. And it should measure what it is supposed to measure. Now, in the context of your qualitative research, this means that your interview guide questions must somehow resemble the data that you want to collect from your participants based from the direction that you want your research to take. Now, in that light, okay, so the validity of the interview guide means that your interview guide questions must cover the scope of your research questions and the scope of your study. If you're going to study about the experiences of disaster volunteers, then your questions have to correspond to those experiences. You cannot ask them questions which are not related to the scope of your study. Now, please take note that in this particular document, I underlined must, and I made mention of the scope of the research questions. Now, if you may remember in my previous videos, I mentioned that your interview guide questions and your RRL themes are all grounded on your research questions, which is important because, again, there is a relationship among the research questions, the RRL themes, and the interview guide or the FGD questions that you are going to be creating. So, as you can see, this is the relationship that they share. Everything is anchored on these research questions, and as such, I think that it is just right that these interview guide and FGD questions have to come from the research questions, and I will be explaining that later in this video. So the next question is how, or what are the guidelines, what are the standards that have to be met when you begin writing your interview guide questions. Now, the next stipulations, or the next facts, concepts that I will be presenting to you are taken from an online source. These are not my personal opinions, although these are the guidelines that I feel strongly about. Okay, these are the guidelines that I follow as well when I teach my students how to write interview guide questions. So these are the guidelines. First, please make sure that when you create research questions, your interview guide questions, these have to be open-ended questions. Now, sir, what are on open-ended questions? Open-ended questions are questions that are not answerable by yes or no. Okay, so these are questions which require long answers, lengthy responses. Next, develop questions within the study's major areas. So you can see I underlined major areas. Now, what are these major areas? Your research questions. Now, as I said, I will be explaining the relationship later on. But um, my suggestion is already surfacing right here, that you have to develop the questions within the major areas of your research. Number 3, questions must be arranged from general to specific. We cannot keep jumping from specific experiences to general perceptions, back to specific experiences, so on and so forth. This is not a to and fro of general to specific, specific to general. No. This is a logical flow of questions arranged from general to specific. Next, make sure that you are also going to adjust the language or the words to fit the profile of your participants. Okay, sir, what's the difference? Language and words are most likely the same. Language means if your participants are not able to comprehend English very well, you might want to adjust the language. If they feel more comfortable talking to you in Filipino or in the vernacular, then by all means do so. Next, you have to adjust the words. You cannot use the same words for different participants. This is most applicable when you are conducting a multiple case study. Why? The words may not be applicable to all of your participants, especially when these participants come from different fields. This pertains to jargon, specialized languages, specialized words or terms that only these people use, but not for other people. Okay, so for example, in the case of doctors, they have jargons. In the case of engineers, they have jargons. You cannot use the same words that you would ask an engineer and then use them to ask the people in the medical field. Next, in order for you to ensure question number 1, open-ended questions, this is just a suggestion of the site. You might want to ask how questions or emphasize on how questions and maybe some why questions but with very little emphasis. Okay, so prioritize this type of questioning and then this type of questioning. Okay, why? Because these are the questions that demand long answers. These are the questions which require your participants to give you more details, as opposed to simply asking them yes or no questions. Okay, are you a disaster volunteer? Yes, it's a total waste of time. Okay, so ask how and why questions, or maybe questions that resemble a how or a why question. Next, okay, number 6 is very important. You have to establish rapport with your participants by asking warm-up questions. You don't dive into a serious line of questioning right there and there. Okay, you can ask them warm-up questions which will help them feel more comfortable with you as an interviewer. And last but not the least, the final question may look into a sense of closure. Okay, there might be a hanging question. Sir, what happened to what questions or who questions? These questions may be asked nearing the end of your interview or as a follow-up question, but never the main question. Okay, so the last question in your interview could look into a sense of closure, to signal that you are nearing the end of your interview session. Okay, so these questions come from sociology .fas.harvard.edu, and these are also the guidelines that I follow in teaching my students how to create interview guide questions. Okay, so moving on, we have validity. We have discussed validity. We have begun discussing um, the construction of your interview guide questions, focusing on the guidelines. Now we move on to the types of questions. Okay, so there are so many different types of questions that you can ask. I focused on the 6 major types of questions that I feel are applicable, especially for you guys who are still in the senior high school level. First would be the direct questions, and as you can see, I gave an example. Okay, an example of a direct question would be, do you still feel happy when serving customers? This is a question that attacks the phenomenon directly. Okay, it attacks an issue directly. Sir, this question demands, this question may not have a lengthy answer. Yes, but it will allow your participants to explain their answers to this question. Okay, so do you still feel happy when serving customers? Yes, and then an explanation. Second, uh, you have your indirect questions. Okay, how do most students perceive the use of Blackboard or the learning management system? This is a question that is indirect because we are not going for a specific answer. No, we are gunning for answers or varied answers from your participants. As you can see, it simply deals with perception. Okay, so there is a number of possibilities of perceptions that they may have about a particular a phenomenon. Okay, particular phenomenon. Third, you have follow-up questions. Could you give examples or scenarios that uh, pertain to your main problem? Okay, so these are types of questions which follow the main questions. As you can see, they are simply follow-up questions. Number 4, you have probing. Why do you perceive it that way? Okay, so these types of questions usually follow the main questions right here. Okay, so um, you don't ask these as main questions. Again, they are probing questions, which means if your participants do not give you a well substantiated answer, you ask these probing questions for you to get more or for you to extract more details and data from your participants. Now, down to the last 2. The 5th example would be specifying questions. Okay, from the word itself, it asks your participants to specify their answers. What was your initial reaction? Okay, we are going for a specific reaction, a specific response. And last but not the least, we have interpreting. Okay, so interpreting questions are clarificatory questions. This is you rephrasing their statements. Okay, so is it safe to say that living alone has taught you independence? This approach is interpretive because you have your own interpretation to their statements. Okay, and let's say hi to Sir AJ. Hi, Sir AJ.
Hello, good morning.
Good morning. Okay, so note, you may have direct and indirect questions as your main questions, and then the other forms of questions will act as your supporting questions or your probing questions in the long run. Okay, so down to the last portion of the discussion. What are the steps in writing your interview guide questions? Tada! Okay, step 1. For me, I always start by creating a table. In that table, I place the research question. the main interview guide questions, and the probing or the follow-up questions. Now, going back to my initial statement that there is a relationship between or among the research questions, the RRL themes, and your interview guide questions. Goodbye, Sir AJ. Um, this is the perfect example of that relationship. Since all the questions are anchored on the research questions, as you can see here, you always begin by indicating your research questions and the interview guide questions, which are under that main research question. Okay, and followed by the different probing questions for every interview guide question that you have in column number 2. Will this be the format of your interview guide questionnaire? Probably not. This is just a way for you to begin composing your interview guide questions. Step number 2. You formulate your main interview guide questions based on the research question. Step 3. You arrange the main interview guide questions from general to specific following the guidelines I gave a while ago. And step 4, you're going to formulate possible probing questions or follow-up questions for every main interview guide question that you are going to have. Sir, why is possible underlined? It is underlined because, again, as I said, these probing questions are there just in case your participants do not give you a well-substantiated response. There are participants who are worthy, who are able to explain their thoughts, their experiences, their narrations in great detail. But there are also participants who do not give you lengthy responses. They will just give you a snippet of their actual response and then stop. That is the reason why you should have probing questions, so that if they do give you a short response, you can ask the follow-up questions in order for them to give you more answers. Now, we go to the last step. The last step is to secure or to look for someone who can validate your question or your questionnaire. Make sure that this person is an expert and not necessarily your classmate or your teacher. Okay, this is an expert in the field that you are trying to pursue. Now, to end this video, allow me to give you a sample because I just love samples. I'll give you a sample of the relationship or a sample breakdown of a research question, a main interview question, and a sample or a possible probing question. Okay, one of you guys, maybe one group might find this question to be, or this sample to be helpful. Ta-da! Okay, sample. Research question number 1. What are the lived experiences of disaster volunteers in Davao City? Okay, or maybe you can change the city. If you're conducting a study in Cebu and you want to know the the lived experiences of disaster volunteers in your area, then you might want to edit this one. Okay, now from this research question, I gave one sample interview guide question. Could you tell me the story of how you became a disaster volunteer? Okay, so this way they are going to tell you the story. Again, we're looking at the lived experiences, and since we are going for the lived experience, your question in your interview guide must help you get a picture of that experience. That's why we started with a general concept of how they became a disaster volunteer. Okay? Now, possible probing question. Was there a specific person or event that or who pushed you to become or to decide to become or to answer this calling? Okay, so By then they are going to tell you what specific events or which specific people influence them to become a disaster volunteer. Again, that is just a sample, and your line of questioning may vary depending on the requirement of your research question and your study as a whole. So, to give you a sort of review, we discussed validity and how it is applied in the concept of constructing research questions or interview guide questions. Second, I gave you the guidelines in writing research interview guide questions. Third, I gave you your steps in writing your research interview questions. And finally, I also gave you the types of questions that you might want to ask in your interview guide questionnaire. We ended with a sample of the relationship between and among the research question, the interview guide question, and the probing questions, which I have discussed earlier in this video. So, that would be all. I hope that this video again was helpful to you guys. This is Sir Dardar. Class dismissed.